Thank you to all the supporters of HMS Unicorn who made this online talk possible. If you would like to support the work of HMS Unicorn, then please head to www.hmsunicorn.org.uk and donate. Life as a Wren, a story of the Second World War. Guest speaker Vicky Unwin. Finlay Raffle speaks with author Vicky Unwin about her book Love and War in the Wrens, Letters Home, 1940 to 46. The book is based on the letters of Vicky's mother, Sheila Mills, who joined the Women's Royal Naval Service in 1940. Sheila was a clever, middle-class Norfolk girl who wanted to escape the shackles of secretarial work in London, her unhappy childhood, and her social climbing mother. Starting with Sheila's first posting to Scotland at the start of the war, the letters chart her progress through the ranks, first to Egypt and later to a vanquished Germany. So I'd like to say a final sort of welcome everyone and thank you for joining us at this lunchtime Q&A with author Vicky Unwin. I'll be speaking with Vicky about her book Love and War in the Wrens, Letters Home 1940 to 46, and that's based on the letters of Vicky's mother Sheila Mills. Sheila served during the Second World War as a member of the Women's Royal Naval Service. She was posted to Scotland, to Egypt, and later to a vanquished Germany. And where the lovely connection with Unicorn is that Sheila was actually up in Dundee during the Second World War and was actually involved with Unicorn for a short time before going to maybe some more exotic climbs elsewhere. Vicky Unwin herself is an author with a long career in both book and newspaper publishing, centred around her African roots, and she's currently the chair of the Wasafiri magazine. Please correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Vicky. And she's a Cairn Prize Council member. Okay. She writes extensively about living with cancer and is a trustee of Transform Drug Policy Foundation. She now lives in London, and she did inform me that her internet can be patchy at times down there. So if she does freeze on us for a few seconds, it's not a problem. She will come back. She's promised me, so that's good news. But yeah, I'd just like to say thank you, Vicky, and welcome.
Thank you, Finlay. It made me sound very grand.
Well, that's all right. So I guess I'd like to start by asking that the book tells your mother's story as a Wren during the Second World War and draws on sort of hundreds of her own personal letters. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how the book came about and why you decided to tell your mother's story.
Well, I always knew, obviously, my mum had been a Wren and she was very proud of that part of her life. In fact, she said it was the best thing she'd ever done. And she always said, one day I'm going to write my memoirs, and I've kept all my letters, are all around. And she was obviously planning to do it because when she died rather suddenly, I was clearing up her house and I found all these black bin bags, which almost got junked, but knowing my mother, I didn't junk them because she kept everything. She was a Second World War hoarder. She used to wash up the plastic yogurt pots and hang the foil on the line to dry and all that kind of stuff. So when I started to go through them, she'd actually already begun to group her letters into years, from 1940 through. And actually, there were a whole lot of other letters which became the source of my other book. So, I just looked at them, put them away. And then years later, I had a broken hip and I was in Switzerland and I had 9 weeks of bed rest. So I decided to sort out and catalogue the letters. And then a little time later, I suddenly realised it was the big anniversary, I think the 75th anniversary of the Second World War, and I'd better do something about these letters and write my mother's memoirs. So I did it for her. And that's how the book got to be written. I wrote it actually, I wrote the actual book in about 6 weeks, but it took years to catalogue and transcribe the letters.
That's lovely. Had your mother spoken much about her experiences before, or were the letters a bit of a revelation, for you?
Complete revelation, because the hilarious thing is that the letters were all to her mother. Now, she and her mother famously did not get on. They really, really did not get on. My grandmother was a terrible snob. and was mortified that her husband didn't seem to be able to work or have a job. In fact, I think the best job he ever got was, being in the ARP during the Second World War. Otherwise, he was selling dictionaries and vacuum cleaners. But he was actually a First World War hero. He was awarded the Military Cross, and he was gassed. So it wasn't that he was such a deadbeat. It was just he was incapable. So it is extraordinary that, she decided to write these letters to her mother. And the tone, I think, what is really interesting about them is that it becomes a sort of a game of reciprocity. So as you see in the early letters, she's up in Scotland very early on, and she asking her mum to send her everything from tights to apples to chocolate to stamps, whatever. Her beaver coat, I think, makes several mentions and stuff like that. But when she was posted to Egypt later, the tables are completely turned, and she's sending her mother things into rationed wartime Britain. So I think it's a really interesting juxtaposition. And of course, she wanted her mother to save the letters, because my mum was actually very well educated, although she never went to university, and was very smart. And I think she had a tremendous sense of history. So when she wrote her letters, she's always describing the people, the place, as much of the experience of what was going on as she possibly could. I mean, her letters, which we can talk about a bit later, about the flap and going around, the surrender of the Italian fleet and things like that, are really atmospheric and evocative of what she was able to write about the war.
Well, yes, that's lovely. I mean, I know that in the book, and you've spoken before about that sort of relationship between your mother and grandmother. And so I suppose that sort of first relationship, or the early part of her life, you've described your mother as sort of a clever, middle-class Norfolk girl. And so, I mean, what was it like when she was growing up, sort of in Norfolk? And, was it sort of a happy experience before the war started?
It really wasn't, actually. My mother had an older sister who is the source of much carping in the letters. The older sister was adored. My mother was not. She was beaten, and she was treated very badly by my grandmother. My grandmother was sort of middle-class Monkey, or in a sense, she had to keep a boarding house because they were really quite poor in Huntston. But they had rich relatives, and my mother didn't lack for education. She went to a very posh place called Wren College. I've still got some of her school books, actually, which are beautifully illustrated. Her history books, her English books. She showed a great penchant for drawing even then, because she became quite artistic later on. It was a happy family life in the sense that she had lots of lovely friends and relations, but her home life, although she adored her father, who was henpecked, was not particularly happy. So where this book jumps in is she couldn't wait to get away. So first of all, she went to St. James's College in London to learn secretarial skills, and she became one of their top students with 140 words per minute, shorthand, or was that typing skills? Anyway, I can't remember. Anyway, she was a top student. And this stood her in very good stead, actually, in the Wrens, because she was always the best at doing all that kind of thing. And funnily enough, one of her tutors ended up in, I think, in HMS Unicorn, or certainly in Dunfermline, in HMS Unicorn, as one of the Wrens, the top Wrens. So that was quite extraordinary, a Miss Kidd.
All right. Well, I'll be having to look into that now next. That's my next one. So I suppose, so she's going into the war. I'm writing, she's joining up in 1940, and she's sent north to Dunfermline, which I assume is not somewhere she'd been gone to before and had explored before. So I suppose it was about that idea of why she joined up. You'd said she was sort of raring to get away and to go somewhere. And what were those early experiences like when she's being sent up to a new place in 1940?
Well, it's ironic, really, because although she despised her mother, she inherited much of her middle-class snobbery. So she was pretty appalled by some of the other people that she was, she had to share her quarters with, and who stole her stockings and, got her into trouble on various occasions, because she was a snob, and it goes through all the letters. And I think she found it very difficult. I think they all lived in very close quarters. She tells of one incident where she was very, very early on. They had a party, and a young, I guess, a guy from the army or the navy gave her some secret gin and lime, and one of the girls, a real stinker, she says, told on her, and she got into terrible trouble from, the chief Wren, and I think she found it very difficult. Actually, I think she was very homesick. The food was awful. Oh, someone's just coming through the door. The food was awful, and it was very cold, and she didn't have nice clothes. They didn't get their. Can you hear me still? I just got onto headphones. Yeah. She didn't. Lost my thread now because someone's just come through the door. And the work actually initially was very boring. She had to do lots of standing up, doing filing. She was very much the lowest of the low. And from those very early beginnings in Dunfermline / Unicorn, all she wanted to do was to do something really serious for the war effort. And her mindset very early on is to become an officer as soon as possible, get away from all these, the privations of being in Scotland, but actually at the same time also to have a very good time. They didn't actually have to wear uniform for 3 months because there wasn't any. All the depots had been bombed. So the letters at the early part are constant to and fro to mum, send this, send that, nail polish, lipstick, my red jumper, my evening dress, and do just the frills. And meanwhile, she's stuffing herself with cream teas. I think there are 28 mentions of tea. And getting rather buxom on Scottish food.
Oh, it's you mentioned there about sort of slightly more enjoyable aspects of that, and about one of the male officers giving her some things. And I know that when she was in Dundee at the time, if people aren't aware about Dundee in the Second World War, there was quite a big naval presence, and there was a submarine base, an HMS Ambrose and HMS Unicorn, and so there were lots of people from all over. Really, there were lots of Dutch officers, Polish, yep, Scottish, British, and so I know that the name is it Yap comes up in your mum's letters as sort of an early admirer, an early I don't know what you would describe him as.
It's very hard to tell from my mum's letters, but reading them again, as I did just for this session, she already had a boyfriend who was on HMS Sheffield, a Durham boy called Paul. And then she met this Dutch submarine commander, or, someone who worked on the Dutch subs, Yap. And there's a very nice photograph of him in the book. And I think she actually did fall madly in love with him. I think that was the first person who really broke her heart. And this was when she was working at Ambrose, and I think they were living in a place called Mayfield House in Dundee, and the house was divided into two. So the Dutch lived in one half and the English Wrens lived in the other half. So, and her best friend at the time was actually valeting or backwomaning for, the Dutch. So there's lots of opportunities for chocolates and stockings and things to change hands. And, they took them dancing, they took them skating, they took them to the movies, they took them to the theatre, they took them to concerts. They had a really fantastic time. But you have to read the letters carefully. There were terrible air raids. People were getting killed. They were quite often in the basements, taking shelter. And they were actually working very hard. I mean, she was a cipher officer, and so she was learning the ropes of how to do ciphers. And there were very long shifts. I mean, one of the most exciting things, there were two exciting things that happened, I think, when she was in Scotland. The first one, she writes a marvellous letter about going on a real ship, with real sailors and all the, fun that they had. And she was so thankful she had on her knickers that are, sewn together at the knees, because, they had to go up and down all these stairs, and very worried about people looking up their skirts, upskirting, I think it's called these days. And, again, lovely tea on the boat, and, far too much to drink. And some of the Wrens got tiddly, and this was very bad form. So, and that made her really, really have a sense of adventure for what could happen in the future.
Yes, and although, as you say, you mentioned those sort of the enjoyable aspects of it, your mum, by the sounds of it, also seemed quite driven and wanted to work sort of her way up and kind of improve. I guess that maybe comes, as you say, from that kind of experiences when she was younger and being kind of, top of things. because obviously she works her way through the ranks as she goes. And so although she's in Dundee, she moves on reasonably quickly, if you like, to bigger and better things. I believe that she also met the King and the Queen when they visited Dundee, near the sort of start of the war.
This was at Ambrose, and I think this was the other really exciting thing that happened. I thought I'd read this bit because I think it's better than me paraphrasing it. So this is Sheila on the King and Queen paying a visit to Dundee. It was great fun, and they stopped bang in front of me for quite a while and talked for quite some time. We had several photographs taken for the papers, but the one I've seen was in Tuesday's Scotsman of the Queen signing the visitors' book. The King was a bit grumpy and wouldn't let the Queen inspect us as thoroughly as she would have liked to and speak to us. He was in a terrific hurry, and they didn't even walk up both files, thus nearly leaving the ship without signing the book. There was a terrific scramble, and they signed it just before they left. There were pipes on board with bosun's whistles, a terrible squeak which made us all want to laugh. Miss Overy, that's her boss, was terribly thrilled as she had to conduct the Queen around. So that's a bit on the Queen in Dundee on the HMS Ambrose.
Well, that doesn't sound too bad, I suppose. And
more for Mother's benefit. Mother would have been so impressed with that, and I think Mother's approbation, the admiration of her mother was the reason that she was so driven to be a success.
There's actually there's footage of the Queen and the King visiting Dundee at that time, and it might be that Sheila's actually in some of the footage, but there's certainly people very excited, and I'm sure the mum your grandmother would have been very proud to know that she got to meet the King and the Queen. When I suppose she moves on from Dundee, and she takes more courses, and she's working towards being promoted to third officer in the Wrens, which she does manage to become, and she moves to Methil in Fife, so she moves back slightly further south again. And from what I understand when reading the letters, she actually meets quite a few people that would later become sort of closer friends at that time.
I think the Methil place, I mean, they had their own rooms. I think it was really where they took the Wrens that they wanted to make officers, from what I could sort of surmise from all that. So the people that she met there did indeed, 4 of them were on her boat out to Egypt and remained, great friends for the rest of her life. And I think that was, she actually met some other, there were Poles there, in fact. And she learned how to parachute jump. And I think Methil was, she really quite enjoyed it, although the work was very boring and she didn't get on with her boss. But my mum had this thing, she really did cross swords with people every now and again, and it wasn't really very, very good for her. But then all her friends began to leave, and then she started to feel very dissatisfied. And I think, she was always saying, oh, can I really do this? And I really want to go out, and, I'm too young to be promoted, but I know I can do it. And then anyway, luckily, just before her 21st birthday, she was called on that officers training course in Greenwich, and her promotion happened really in quite a hurry to third officer, and then going out to Egypt.
Yes, you say that in early, I made a note of the phrase that you used, because in early 1942, you write that for Sheila, the war is about to become interesting at last. So obviously, that says something about it. So in early 1942, as you mentioned, she's leaving bonny Scotland, and she's heading to maybe slightly more exciting, well, in some people's opinion, more exciting places, obviously. And so where does she get posted next?
So I think it's quite important to set the war in a kind of context, because what happened was they promoted a lot of the Wren officers very quickly, and they needed to shift people to new battlegrounds, so to speak, because the war at the beginning of 1942 was going very, very badly. I mean, we were about to lose, because Japan had joined Germany, they'd bombed Pearl Harbor, America had joined the war. But on the other hand, the Nazis were approaching Moscow, Singapore had surrendered, Tobruk had fallen. It was really a big mess. So Churchill and Roosevelt had, got this plan of actually trying to move the theatre of war to get back Africa and then move into Europe via Italy. So they sent out all these, a lot of troops, including my mother, on her 3-month boat trip around Cape Horn via Sierra Leone and South Africa, eventually arriving in Alexandria, I suppose, mid-1942 with German measles. So the first thing she had to do was go into sick bay. But it did improve after that. What can I do?
That's all right. I was going to ask you, I mean, when she arrives in Alexandria, I guess, is that her first time being abroad, you know, out of the UK?
I think she may have been, I'm not sure. She may have been to Europe, maybe, I'm not sure actually, but I mean, certainly nowhere, you know. And I think what was really, because she was well read and was interested, she did notice that Alexandria was a very beguiling city, you know, because I don't know if you've read the Alexandrian Quartet or any of those by Lawrence Durrell, or, you know, the poems of Cavafy or any of those sorts of things. It was a really seedy, amoral, immoral place with a good part and a bad part. And of course, the Wrens and the soldiers weren't allowed to go into the bad parts. But I think they knew they existed. And, you know, the women always had to be chaperoned. They were all holed up in convents and barracks like that. So they weren't allowed to go out too much, and movement was quite restricted. But, you know, guess what? They had a fantastic time. They were by the sea. There was the racetrack, I can't remember, the Alexandria Club, where they had racing and golf and tennis and swimming, and they had a beach hut, and there were all these lovely boys to play with, basically, in both senses. And Alexandria was the home of the 8th Army to a large extent. So a lot of the chaps were billeted there and took their R&R in Alexandria. So it was a very exciting place to be, because although she couldn't write about it that much, what she would have heard from them was about what was going on the front. And her job would have been, as we know, would have been tracking all the naval movements from both the enemy and our own ships. So she knew exactly what was going on in the war, but of course couldn't write about it because of censorship.
Do you think she was finding the work in Alexandria more interesting, more meaningful than what she'd been doing back home?
Yeah, she loved it. She loved it. I mean, it was fascinating, because you were really at the heart of things, and it was in Alexandria. I talked about her the 8th Army. It's where she met the next great love of her life, this man John Pretty, who she has this on-off affair with for years and years and years. And if you read my second book, you'll find he crops up again in the 1950s, several years later. But, you know, she's very conscious of now how things are going in the UK, and it's not good. So she's beginning to send the parcels home to her mum of, you know, all sorts of exotic things, not just food, but silks and slippers and jewelry, and even to her, you know, her love-hate relationship sister. She's sending all sorts of things. And all she wants in return is letters from home, actually, because I think they were all very homesick. So she quite often says things like, you know, I'd love to be in England now that spring is here, kind of letter. You know, I can imagine the bluebells and the daffodils. And meanwhile, here we've got so many strawberries, melons, mangoes. It seems awful, but I'm sick of them. You know? And, you know, champagne and wine and Pims, and, you know, it's just a fantastic lifestyle. And I think they all realized they were having the time of their lives while Europe was not in such a good state. And I think talking about that, there is a marvelous letter, because, you know, the Germans got very close to taking Alexandria, and Alexandria was evacuated. And she writes this long, long letter about how she's evacuated in what was called the Flap, and ended up in Ismailia and Port Said, which again is, you know, it only arrived 6 months later, but it's a marvelous description of how really dicey things were and how everybody panicked and was evacuated.
Yes, you mentioned, I was just going to ask again about, you mentioned John Pretty as the sort of next real sort of male sort of figure that features a lot. And there's again something that you'd written that your mother used to say about how she'd always say, "Oh, I should have married John Pretty," this kind of thing. And did you know much about the man himself and sort of his background and how that had all sort of how it'd gone on, that kind of thing?
Well, he was Scottish, and in fact, she'd met his sister in Scotland when they were training, and she was also a Wren who came out to Egypt. I think he came from a very good family. But I know she always says, you know, I should have married John Pretty, but actually he really wasn't a very nice man. Nor was one of the other boyfriends she had in Germany, who was very similar, you know, had terrible jealous rages and would, you know, he tried to announce their engagement secretly without telling her in the newspapers in Egypt. And when he was away, you know, he considered her his property because they were going out. But my mum's view was, you know, these boys have gone to the front. I'm going to have a good time. I'm going to go out dancing and eating and having fun with whoever I like, because we're not engaged. I refuse to get married. And actually, underneath it all is the rather, you know, the rather grim realization is that, you know, maybe some of these guys just won't come back. So it is really eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we may die.
Yes, and I think that comes through. Sort of moving your mother's story forward again into 1943. She gets a move to Cairo this time, I believe, and she's part of something called Operation Husky. So if people aren't aware about Operation Husky, would you be able to tell us a little bit about maybe the operation, what it was, and your mother's sort of part of it?
The Operation Husky actually was the turning point of the war for the Allies, because we had just won El Alamein, but we really needed to get Hitler where it hurt and get the army's attention from the Russian front, and, you know, get them down into somewhere else so the Russians wouldn't get beaten. So this was the invasion of Sicily, which was planned by Admiral Ramsay, who was actually also then went over to plan the D-Day landings, and was sadly shortly after that shot down and died. But he was and was the head of the Navy during that, you know, the commander-in-chief of the Navy during D-Day landings. So she was handpicked. You know, she was the only woman, the only Wren in a small group of 8 to 10 people in a dusty old room where they planned this operation, which was completely thrilling. And, you know, it was a great success. Montgomery commanded the land troops, Ramsay the sea troops, and their losses compared to the Germans were minimal. And it was from there that they were able to jump in and invade Italy itself. And Mussolini then, you know, resigned and was captured. Didn't stop the Germans, but it was the beginning of the end for the Germans and the beginning of the beginning for the Allies.
And I think another thing that comes through in Cairo, again, your mum, you know, this important operation and the sort of turning point for the Allies, but at the same time, writing of that never-ending social whirl of dining, dancing, sightseeing, yachting, races. So again, it's that mix of the two, you know.
I think it's. I think everyone was living on a complete edge, actually, you know, because life was so precarious. And what is fascinating is she never mentions once anybody who didn't make it. And I don't know whether that was to protect her mother's sensibilities in the end, because there must have been lots of people she knew who didn't make it. But you know, none of her close boyfriends died, so she was very lucky, I think.
I mean, I know that your mother keeps writing sort of home in this period. Do you think that the sort of distance of being away sort of helped with the relationship between your mother and her mother and her sister? You know, what had been more difficult, was it to sort of distance bring them closer, do you think, or not?
Yeah, I think when, you know, what's that terrible cliche, absence makes the heart grow fonder. I think that all disappeared when, you know, things went wrong later in life. They sort of died bitter enemies, respectively. So, but during the war, I think what was really galling for my mother was that her mother was always criticising her, even in the letters, and she never said to Sheila, gosh, you know, I'm so proud of you for your part in Operation Husky and this and that and the other. She never said it. And there's one letter where my mother says, I just don't believe you can't say something nice to me sometimes, you know. So it's very sad, isn't it? You know, all this was to win her mother's favour, and she never got it, really. I'm sure her mum was very pleased to have the old, you know, the all the gifts, the butter and the sugar and the jam and all the rest of it. But it didn't seem to go much beyond that.
I think and when we're sort of into 1943 and 1944, your mother tells more experiences about traveling sort of in the Middle East and doing things and doing a bit more. I mean, did she move about quite a bit? It seems like she moved around quite a lot over those sort of few years in North Africa.
Well, it seems so, but actually she was very unlucky because they were meant to get a lot of leave, but because she was ciphers and was doing such important work, she didn't actually have any leave for something like the first 2 years that she was in Egypt, apart from the odd day when she could go to Cairo, the odd day here and there. But they were meant to get, you know, 7 days every 2 months or something, and she was never allowed it. So eventually, at the end, when Italy had been invaded and she was getting very, very bored and frustrated because she was desperate to go to Ceylon or India or, you know, anywhere but Egypt, because she just felt she was doing a rather unimportant job because it had been so demoted in the war effort. She did take her leave and she went to Palestine with John Pretty on a holiday, and they fought constantly, I think. With one of her Wren friends, she went to Beirut and up to Damascus and had a really amazing time. But I think that was the only, you know, she never got to see, she never went to Luxor or did anything really that you would expect someone living in Egypt to do, because she actually worked incredibly hard.
Yes, she always seemed to be sort of working relentlessly, really, for the entirety of the war. I suppose by mid-1944, for Sheila, the war is beginning to come to an end. And was she still getting frustrated by the work, and was she looking forward to being able to come back to the UK, or was she just disappointed she wasn't getting to go elsewhere?
I don't think she sort of put herself up for going back to the UK in frustration. She really didn't want to go back unmarried, I think. But she did end up going back to the UK. And of course, there's a big gap in the letters, but not before she left Egypt under a cloud. And I think this was something that was very sad for her because it was never spoken of in any letters. And I found documents hidden very secretly when I looked through her things. She had apparently disobeyed an order, although she'd had permission to disobey it, all to do with her leaving Egypt. And she was confined to quarters for not catching a train the evening before, having been told she could wait till the next day, but all her laundry was was being in the lawn at the Dobies, and so she couldn't leave. She didn't have anything to take with her. So she was absolutely devastated, I think, by this. Don't know how it affected her career, but it was, the final thing after 2.5 years in Egypt was to leave under a reprimand, and this was terrible for her. Anyway, she went back to England and did some more ciphering courses, and she was there for about, 6 months, but she ended up posted back to Germany just before the end of the war in 1945. She must have gone in early May or late April.
So yes, I think that when the war in Europe at least sort of comes to an end on sort of 7th of May, early May 1945,
yeah.
And Sheila's, I suppose, to what is by then a vanquished, war-weary and sort of in certain areas destroyed Germany. So, what was she being posted out there for? And I mean, what was that like after being, Africa, back to England, and then suddenly to a sort of vanquished nation?
Well, first of all, I think she was thrilled to be back doing something valuable rather than sitting at home, not home, but sitting in the UK, not ciphering ship movements or whatever. So she was sent to Kiel and then to a place called Plön, which was near the Schleswig-Holstein border, because even though there had been Victory Day in Europe and all the rest of it, there was still an awful lot of stuff to attend to, like the whole of the German Navy, all of the German army, what was left of it. It was called the denazification of Europe, and the British set up a whole department which she was tempted to join at first, but she found the people too common. And I think actually what she meant by that was they were all civilians, and they didn't really respect the military and naval people enough for what they'd actually been doing for the last 2 or 3 years. So they just come from, fairly comfortable jobs in City Street, and just didn't get it really. So she declined to do that and agreed to stay on in the Wrens, and basically was just involved in the denazification of Germany, which was, of course, what my father was also sent to do he was a Royal Naval Volunteer at the end of the war. And indeed, it's where they met, in Kiel, where he was stationed trying to, not trying to, but successfully getting German scientists to defect to the West, because he was a spy with the Ian Fleming T-Force Brigade.
So yes, so she ends up, as you say, meeting Tom at that time, and who himself has his own very interesting story, which I know you've written about as well. I know that when your mum was sent to Germany, she talked about Belsen, and I think what was that like in 45?
I'll read you a little bit about the trial itself, but I just think it's interesting to put it in a context that my mum now was a very well-travelled woman, and she'd seen a lot of things around the world, which a lot of people hadn't, who just came straight from the UK. And I think she, and later my father, were absolutely horrified by the state of Germany. I mean, it had been bombed to smithereens. The people were starving, especially children. They were, living in shells of old houses or on the streets. They were dressed in rags. Meanwhile, they were having the most sumptuous feasts. I mean, I photographed some of the menus that I found in her scrapbook, lobster and caviar and champagne and you name it, all for the occupying British forces. And she felt this was absolutely obscene. Meanwhile, her Batman got 4 crusts of bread, which he had to share with his whole family. And the musicians who smuggled some food out after one of these fantastic parties were sent to jail for 6 months. And she just thought this was terrible. But at the same time, she records that they're fraternizing with Germans who sort of said, oh, well, we weren't really Nazis, of course. We had no idea about the concentration camp. She said, we can't believe it. How did they not know that all this was happening? And so they were horrified by the stuff coming out during the Belsen trials. And she actually said in one of her letters, I really think everybody who's in the British Army should go to one of these trials or the British occupying forces, because it just makes it real and might actually put in a context a bit about how the Allies really starved the Germans after the war, and thousands, if not millions of them died because we didn't give them any food and we didn't do any reparations or help them rebuild the country until, in fact, the Iron Curtain came down and the Cold War started. So it's quite a mixed emotion. So I'll just read you this book, this bit. It's quite short, but I think it, again, I can't really paraphrase it. On Friday, I went to Lüneburg to attend the Belsen trials. We've been given a pass for 4 until the end of the trials, and it was most interesting. Lüneburg is about an hour and a quarter from here, through the outskirts of Hamburg, where I've never seen such bombed streets in my life. They have to be seen to be believed. Rows and rows of rubble-lined roads, not a thing left standing, with grotesque twisted girders here and there, and perhaps a fragment of a house every few hundreds of yards. Absolutely frightful. However, we got to Lüneburg in the pouring rain and were led into the courtroom, which was not at all full. It was arranged in a square. The judges, 2 army brass hats, and a bewigged gentleman sat opposite the accused, 50 of the most bestial and terrible people I have ever seen, who had large numbers hanging round their necks. They looked more like animals than people, and as we walked in, most of them stared with curious bravado, to which we stared hard back. Irma Gräser, now she was the most notorious concentration camp guard from Ravensbrück, who had single-handedly murdered thousands of women. Irma Greza was number 9, and true to descriptions, she is a glamorous bit of work with very long ash blonde locks hanging down her back. We heard 2 statements made by her on capture, read by the prosecution, and all the accused were intently following from the papers they all had. They chatted to each other, and some of them even smiled in conversation. It seemed extraordinary. So that was the Belston trials. I think everyone was found guilty, and I think most of them were executed.
It's certainly it's an amazing sort of letter to be able to have, and that sort of writing about it. I mean, I suppose at the time, you know, the way she describes Germany and really the sort of sadness and the destruction of the place. I guess for Sheila, at the same time, she's able to meet a man or a gentleman who would sort of become the figure for the kind of, you know, rest of her life. And so at this sort of meeting with Tom, how quickly does that progress? And do they both come back to the UK as sort of together? And how does that all end happily for her?
Well, it's quite funny, really. She met him within the first month of her arriving. They met on VE Day, and they went sailing. And she just describes him en passant as having lots of horrible spots on his neck. So he's obviously very unattractive. And then she goes off somewhere else, and he goes off somewhere else. And they don't meet again until she goes back to Kiel later. Meanwhile, she's dumped by the man she hoped to marry, which is, we haven't mentioned him, but he's a Captain Bruce Booth Mason, who was one of the really nice guys but got cold feet, and stood her up on when she went on leave to meet him in London. He didn't turn up, and she was obviously completely heartbroken. But she had, you know, Captain Ken Miller in Germany, who was another John Pretty, and so she had, and Barry, and I don't know, whoever, all these boys. But she was really in a turmoil. And then my dad turns up, and he was, apart from the spots on his neck, he was very handsome, very charming, much younger than her. He was Czech, and she didn't know it, but Jewish, and spoke fluent German, so could actually show her a completely different side of life. And they gelled fairly early on, actually. And she came back first, and he came back afterwards when he was... No, he came back first and was demobbed and was looking for a job, and they got secretly engaged, and then finally they got married at the end of 1946.
And was it a sort of a marriage, a union that the Sheila's family were happy about?
I think they were, because he charmed the pants off them, basically, you know, because he could. He was terribly rude about them behind their backs, her father and mother, well, her mother in particular, although he struck up a great bond with her later on. But the letters leading up to their marriage are worth reading. They're just, and you realise that this marriage is doomed for disaster, actually. You know, he wouldn't let her spend any money on this and that, and all the, you know, money they were given had to be spent on household things, and nothing could be wasted, and no one was allowed to be invited, and, you know, etc., etc. So he was very controlling, even about the wedding, and it was a bad sign. But there you are. They got married, and they went on honeymoon to the Lake District, and after that they went off to Africa.
And so it continues. So I suppose I kind of wanted to finish by asking, I generally overall for Sheila's time during the war, do you think she enjoyed her wartime experience as a Wren and what she did? And did she find that, I suppose, that adventure that she'd been looking for sort of stuck in Norfolk?
I think she found it, you know, in spades. I mean, I think she had the most. She always said the war was fantastic, and she felt so guilty about having had such a good time. But at the same time, you know, she did do incredibly important work when they were running all those ships that were going around the Mediterranean. You know, they were saving lives because of all those convoys that were going, you know, to and fro, and not only just soldiers, but, you know, people and goods and all the rest of it, and responsible for, you know, sinking some of the enemy. So I think that was, and also at the end of the war in Germany, I think she found it a very humbling experience, actually. And I think it did shape her, because she and my father became sort of very socialistic, really, after that. And they both wanted to do good in the world as a result of what they'd seen and what they'd done. So I think she certainly found the adventures. She certainly married the most unsuitable person ever in terms of, rebelling against her mother's middle classness. If her mother had known he was Jewish, she would have actually turned in her grave, and she probably still would be doing. So she certainly
Well,
got an adventure.
well, we'll have to get you back to speak about the father side of the story as well, because I know you've written about that, and it's also fascinating. So I would just like to say, I know that we're probably coming to the end of our time here. So thank you very much, Vicky. It really has been fascinating. Thanks for sharing your mother's stories and letters and experiences, because it really does sort of bring to life the war itself and the sort of stories of different parts of the war.